Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I want to pay my respects to their emerging leaders, past, present and emerging, and also warn people that there is a photograph of an Aboriginal person who has died in this presentation. So, as Paul said, I came across this wonderful story when I was researching the life of Anne Smith here, who was the wife of the founder of Smithfield here. And the Smith had a much more interesting life than just being here in South Australia. That's interesting enough. They were actually spent quite a few years in New Zealand and were there at the birth of that nation and were actually personally involved in quite a lot of quite significant events, which I go forward in my book, which I hope to have published soon. It's not yet published, but hopefully by this time next year it will certainly be on the shelves. So if you're interested in that, please put your name down on my contact sheet. I promise I won't spam anyone. I'll just let you know updates of what's going on with it and when it can be purchased. I've also left some brochures out if you're interested in that. So I guess you're all here because you like local history. That's the reason. But hands up if you actually like a good whodunit. Yeah, who doesn't like a good whodunit? Especially true crime, right? So tonight I'm going to ask you to make a decision. I want you to place yourselves in the place of that 1839 jury to decide how Mr Buchanan met his end. Now, in 1839, inquests were held by a coroner, but also in front of a jury. They didn't have any forensics, and there were no detectives to speak of. The world's first detective had only been operating for 3 years in Paris, and there were no detectives in any police force in the world at that time. So by the end of today's talk, you're going to have to decide from 4 possible outcomes. You're going to have to decide if it's a death by a person or persons unknown, it's a strange death, but I don't know who did it, or if it's a death by suicide, that's fairly straightforward. If it was a death by someone that you can name, yeah, I think he did it, and he needs to be arrested, and he needs to then go to trial. So you don't have to decide if this person's guilty. You have to just decide if they've got a likelihood that they did it, and then a trial would be conducted later. The last one, of course, is an open finding. You don't know what happened. Don't know if it was suicide, don't know if it was murder, have no idea. So before discussing the facts, let's set the scene. The year had just ticked over into 1839. And Victoria had only been on the throne for 18 months. Now, Governor Gawler, George Gawler, named this place, of course, was known as the Cockatoo Governor by the Kaurna people because of the feathers in his hat, had just arrived to take over from Governor Heitmann. Now, he found a colony in severe financial difficulties. The coffers were empty, the salaries of the public servants were unpaid, and it was so bad, one official was granted the rations so he would not starve. Now, as you can imagine, public servants are devoting more time to their private enterprises than they would be to their public duties. So process and record keeping was haphazard at best. Now, this is early Adelaide. It was just a collection of huts next to the Torrens. According to Catherine Helen Spence, who arrived that year, it was more incongruous than picturesque. As many you would expect, there'd be wattle and daub huts and probably a few tents, maybe some buildings of mud and stone, only 2 years old, but there were also a surprising number of quite substantial buildings. Now, these were manning structures. They were flat packs. Yeah, IKEA didn't invent that. So these flat packs came out in the belly of a ship. They were a wooden framework and panel walls, and then the roofs and the foundations would be constructed from local materials. And these were both private houses and official buildings. So already things were quite built up, even though it was only 2 years since the proclamation. Even so, already many of these homes and houses and buildings were being replaced by the brick and stone that we're more familiar with. So, on the 8th of January of 1839, the Bardaster, which is a 3-masted bark, arrived in Holdfast Bay, what we now know as Glenelg. She had just completed a 104-day voyage from London, and she had not seen land in all that time. Now, the first thing she did when she arrived in South Australia was drop her South Australian bound passengers straight onto the beach at Glenelg. That was it, they were at their destination, see you later. So they were put onto the sand, and that was it. But this was not her first voyage to Australia. In 1845, she had transported convicts, 240 convicts in the hold, and 50 Marines between the decks. So on this voyage, because she was carrying cargo, she only carried 50 passengers. Now that's not very many for an immigrant ship at the time. They could have as many as 300 people down in that cargo area, but she didn't carry anybody in that cargo area. So she had 3 classes of accommodation. At the end of the ship, in the poop, was the first class accommodation where the captain would be and the very rich people. Then she had a couple of intermediate cabins where middle class people would have travelled, and the bulk of the passengers would have been in the steerage, which were just partitions down the middle of the ship. Now, there were some quite significant people that made a mark on Australia on board, even though there were only 50 people. One of them was Thomas Chirnside, who built the big mansion of Werribee, just outside of Melbourne. Sydney Yates was a child, and he became a North Queensland pastoralist and opened up most of North Queensland to pastoralism. And of course, the people I was interested in, which was John and Anne Smith, who founded Smithfield here in South Australia. Now, this is a painting of the Cygnet arriving. She was part of that first fleet with John Hindmarsh, and it wouldn't have changed very much in those 2 years, apart perhaps the tents would have been gone. So after those passengers were put onto the beach, there was no one there to meet them. Often ships would speak at sea by a series of semaphores. So they'd have these little flags that they would send up, and basic information would go: where are you going, where have you come from, how many people on board, is anyone sick or dead, that sort of thing. And that information would be then taken onto port by the ships. And that didn't happen in the Bardaster's case. So she was unannounced. There was no one there to meet her. Those poor people on the beach, get into Adelaide how you can, don't care. Anyway, so the Bardaster then remained in the Gulf for 2 more weeks, and she was waiting for a pilot to guide her into Port Adelaide, because Port Adelaide was not yet dredged and it was just a tidal sort of area. So those Sydney-bound passengers remained on board. There were 3 men who were sharing one of those intermediate cabins. So these are middle-class men. That was the Reverend Mr Purvis, and he was a man of cloth. Mr Charles Frederick Gorton, who was a Glaswegian, and Mr John Buchanan, the person we're speaking about tonight. So Buchanan's cabin mates knew he was in straitened circumstances. He had left a mercantile house in Liverpool and joined a foot regiment under the alias of Black. Now, that indicates to me that he was in need of reinvention. I don't know what he'd done, why he was trying to escape his past, but he wanted to be a new man. Now, at this point, officers' ranks were bought. You didn't get them through merit. In 1837, the cheapest was as an ensign, and it was £1,200, or $270,000 in today's money. So you had to be a gentleman to be an officer in the military. Now, the thinking behind this was that if you had that sort of money and you were a gentleman, then you had the right sort of background and the right sort of upbringing to be a leader of men. That was all that mattered. Unfortunately for Mr Buchanan, alias Black, he didn't like the military any more than he'd liked the mercantile house. And so his friends bought him out. So he finds himself, still a young man, on his way to Australia, which of course is where all the ne'er-do-wells were sent, with a letter of introduction to a Mr Brown, who was a merchant in Sydney. Interestingly, there was a mercantile house in Liverpool at this time, named Buchanan and Brown, and it sold Australian wool, but as far as I can find, there's no links that I can find at the present, but it seems a very strong coincidence. As you can understand, this young man who's already been a failure twice and was on his way on the other side of the world, banished almost, he may have been more than a little depressed. It's easy to imagine, after 4 months at sea, that the young men were very impatient to quit the ship. On the 16th of January, a week after arriving, John Buchanan borrowed a sovereign from the Reverend Purvis to go ashore. Now, a sovereign is £1, and that equates to about $200 in Australian money today. So he and Mr Gorton are rowed ashore, and Mr Gorton takes with him £2, 10 shillings of his own. And they hit Rundle Street, and as young men are wont to do, they go on a bender. So they go drinking at the London Tavern, and then Mr Gorton buys them both dinner. So he shouts dinner. Then they find accommodation at the Southern Cross Hotel, where they continue to drink. Now, Gorton is known on board as a heavy drinker, Mr Buchanan not so much, but he's persuaded to join in. Okay, hard to believe, isn't it, that this is Curry Street? The Southern Cross Hotel was on the northern side, about 30 metres east of Rosina Street. And you can see the Torrens, the tree line that behind it would have been along the Torrens there. So it was a collection of wooden buildings, and at least one of those was one of those manning flat structures that I talked about. It was one of the best hotels in Adelaide. There were 3 really good ones. This was one of them. And so it was a favoured destination for recent arrivals. It even had its own cart to transport its customers to and from the port. Other Bardaster passengers were also in residence. Robert Dennis and his wife Charlotte, who had arrived at the beach on the week before, were also in residence, and they were steerage passengers. So, the clientele at the time was described as a motley company. Some gentlemen, for what else would they be, were dressed in smart frock coats. You can see that here, the gentleman with the top hat and his smart frock coat. Now that's completely suitable attire for a gentleman. Some were in less formal shooting jackets. A little bit casual, but still gentlemanly attire. And then the most casual of the gentlemen were just in their blouses or their shirts. Now, a gentleman, being, as I said, of high moral character and from the cream of society, was easily identified by his dress. None of these clothing would have been worn by the working classes. A gentleman, you just knew he was a gentleman because of the way he was dressed. Now, alongside these gentlemen were objectionable local men. And they wore red serge shirts, corduroy breeches, and gaiters, which are the leg coverings, as you can see in the photograph to the right. It's a bit later, this one, but you can see he's wearing the gaiters, and that would have been very typical. They had abandoned the social order to wear something, a more utilitarian outfit that was more suitable for Australian conditions, and it was not considered very good. Okay. Right. So in the pre-dawn of Thursday the 17th of January, which is the day after they left the ship, Robert Dennis stumbled upon Mr Buchanan and Mr Gorton at the Southern Cross Hotel. It was very early in the morning. Both were the worse for drink and were seeking more brandy. So I'll assume that they had been up all night drinking. So Mr Gorton and Mr Buchanan found their brandy, had a few tops, and Mr Gorton stumbles back to bed. But Mr Buchanan stays and has a chat with Mr Dennis and tells him that the pair have been robbed of £2 in the night, and he asks Dennis for a loan. And Dennis, who has left the ship and doesn't know if he's going to see these people again, refuses. Later in the morning, when Mr Gorton awoke, he found Mr Buchanan was missing, and so was £2. So Gorton assumed that Buchanan had returned to the ship as planned. He stayed a further 3 nights, returning to the Bardasta, which was still in the Gulf, on Sunday the 20th of January. It was only then that he heard from other passengers that Buchanan had not returned. So 2 days later, on the 22nd of January, the Bardasta finally docked at Port Misery. Now this is Port Misery. It was so called because it was basically a swamp at low tide. It was full of mosquitoes. The drinking water was very brackish, and these are sailors that are carrying the passengers to shore at low tide. It wasn't a very pleasant place. Now we know that on the 22nd of January it was hot, because it was on that day that the huts of James Hertel Fisher and Colonel William Light were burnt down, and they lost so many important documents in those fires. Even so, while the ship was docked at Port Misery, it was very easy to come and go, much easier than it had been when she was out in the Gulf. So 2 more days passed. On Thursday, the 24th of January, Gregory Hawson and a farmhand of Mr Bull were herding cattle at Glen Osmond, at the foot of the Adelaide Hills, very close to where the freeway now goes up, sort of at the Glen Osmond there. And that's about 1.5 hours walk south of Adelaide. And that's when something spooked their animals. Now, that was important for them to investigate that. Any lost animal needed to be accounted for, because this is very early days and they really relied on their animals for food. So Hawson went to investigate, and he was probably worried that bushrangers had perhaps taken an animal. There were bushrangers that were in the hills at that time. They were thought to be escaped convicts come over from the eastern states, or ticket of leave men, but they were actually quite active. Or, of course, it could have been the Ghana people. Now, they had been just 2 years since they were dispossessed from their lands, and they were already complaining about losing access to their hunting grounds and saying that they should be compensated. So, a 1/4 mile from Osmond Gillies' house, now Osmond Gillies was the colonial treasurer, and 20 yards off the path to Mr Gleeson's, who was just a farm, they discovered something truly shocking. Okay. Flies. The first thing that Gregory Hawson would have noticed was the stink of a dead animal. So he came across a clearing, and it was being made by some timber cutters, and under the shade of a large tree at the edge of the clearing, someone had made a seat from the rounds of wood. And underneath that seat was a white straw hat with a black ribbon and a folded kerchief, the sort of thing that a gentleman would wear around his neck. Now, they were placed under that seat as neatly as if someone had been in a boarding house. The next thing that Hawson probably noticed was that strewn across the clearing, as if someone had gone through that very quickly, were the contents of a gentleman's travelling case. So someone had been looking for something. And then perhaps you would have noticed that were radiating out from that seat was a large pool of congealed blood. And in the centre of that pool, he would have noticed an open cutthroat razor. And perhaps a yard or so away where it had been tossed was the case. It might have taken him a few moments to realise that the bundle of clothes just laying at the edge of the clearing was actually the body of a man. And it had been dragged from where it had been died by wild dogs. And they had been having a bit of a nibble. So the fingers of the hands were missing, and there was just bones protruding from the cuffs of his shirt. And his head was quite decomposed. The skull was showing through the skin. And his throat had been very deeply cut. Now, there were no signs of a struggle, and it seemed a very horrible thing for him to have found. So interestingly, no wallet was mentioned. So a wallet at this point was a rather large folio, and it would have held the very large banknotes of the time, as well as stamps and postage, and perhaps that letter of introduction would have been in it. But more crucially, a gentleman would carry his razor in his wallet. So there's three possible scenarios here. We have Mr Buchanan had gone up there, oh woe is me, life is terrible, and he'd slit his throat. Or he'd gone up there and passed out under the tree, and somebody had come along and slit his throat. Or perhaps he was already dead and somebody else had come along and gone through his things and taken it. We just don't know. So this is the area just a few years later. So you can see the road across the plain quite clearly, the Glen Osmond Road there, with Adelaide in the centre of the slide. And to the right, up in the corner, you can just see Port Adelaide. So you would have been able to see the Bardaster quite clearly from this position. So Mr Gleeson's farmhouse is just down there to the right. So that was the farmhouse. The barn of that house still exists. It's on Dashwood Road in Glen Osmond. It's since been converted to a residence. Now Osmond Gillies' house would have been just to the left out of the view of this picture, and it was rebuilt in 1843 as a big mansion Woodley house on Gillies Road, but at this point it was probably another one of those Manning flatpacks. Now, the Glen Osmond Spur, before the building of the Mount Barker Road and the toll house, was the favoured route up into the hills. It was probably following an old Garner trail. And if you go up there today, it's Haywood Drive. It now follows that route. And so if you drive up to the Glen Osmond golf course up there, the view is absolutely spectacular. All right, unsurprisingly, our two men ran for the constables. Now, South Australia has the third oldest centralised police force in the world, and it was established in April 1838, so about 9 months before all of this. And that's less than 10 years after Robert Peel established the London Bobbies, so really, really early. It was organised under Henry Inman, and he was only 21 years old and already an ex-cavalry officer. Now, he was given charge of 10 foot constables, and they patrolled the town, and 10 mounted police, and they were armed, and they were for the outer districts. And of course, Beaumont up there, Glen Osmond would have been considered an outer district at this point. So their role was really to prevent, not to solve crime. So they would have done a rudimentary investigation, and they probably found a few witnesses, but that's about as far as it went. As I said, this was before detectives were a thing, well before case records, and decades before we had the likes of Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie to ignite our imagination. Okay, the inquest. It was convened for the next day, which was Friday the 25th. So the body would have been brought down from Glen Osmond into Adelaide, and 12 men were chosen to be members of the inquest jury. And it was to be conducted by Mr Stevenson, who was coroner at the time. So, Mr George Stevenson had fingers in a lot of pies. He had arrived on the bar below with Hindmarsh as his private secretary, and it was he who read the proclamation at Glenelg that day. It wasn't the governor at all. Now, he and his wife Margaret, whose maiden name was Gorton, no relation that we can discern, but still the same surname, had a 4-acre experimental farm between Melbourne and Finnis Street in North Adelaide. And he was also the editor and part proprietor of the Government Gazette and Colonial Register, which was both a newspaper and the publisher of all government-related business. So he's in an important, unique position of influence. He wears the hats of coroner, he is reporting on the case, and he's also publishing the case. So he has a lot of ability to sway what gets said and what doesn't. And his surviving record, which is the only one of this case, is a lot missing. He doesn't record the names of the jurors. He doesn't record most of the witness names. He doesn't record what was asked. It's really very patchy and frustrating. So, no, we've gone too... No, that's okay. My mistake, sorry. The inquest was held in the newly constructed Queen's Arms Tavern, which was on the corner of Whitmore Square and Brown Street, which is now Morford Street. And it's still there. It's now called the Mismatched Brew House. So you can go down and you can have a drink there and see if you can see any ghosts. So this is a photograph, an old photograph obviously, but the original hotel would have been from that pole on those 4 windows to the right of the photograph. That was the original building, and the rest has been built on later. The publican at this time was Thomas Naslin, you might know from Maslin's Beach. Now, the reason that they chose the Queen's Arms was that it would have had private rooms suitable for business and also good cellars. And that was important because there were no morgues. And it was quite usual for hotel cellars to be used as morgues in this era. Also, it was close to the Supreme Court. So, on the corner diagonally opposite, where the Salvation Army is now, was the first Supreme Court building of our colony, and it was another one of those flat packs. Now, there was a scarcity of lawyers. The only Supreme Court judge of the colony, John William Jeffcott, had drowned the year before, and the only barrister, Henry Gickley, was acting in his place. So there was no ability for the colony of South Australia to hold a murder trial. It just couldn't have been done. And Stevenson would have been aware of this. Another reason for him to be keeping the matter out of the courts if the link with his wife's name wasn't enough. Okay, so the first 2 people to give evidence at the inquest were the surgeons Woodford and Wyatt, and they were expert witnesses. So they examined the body in front of the jury. Everybody was there to see the gore. They described the incision as exceptionally deep, separating both the trachea and the esophagus. Coroner Stevenson asked if suicide was a possibility, and they say they had never seen it so deep due to want of nerve. So usually when someone tries to commit suicide by slicing their throat, they'll have a couple of goes and then they might manage to cut through their vein, but not usually slice it all the way through. However, the good doctors could not rule it out. They like to sit on the fence, these two. It did not appear that they had visited the scene and could not or would not say if the incision was the cause of death. Now you wonder how someone could survive having their trachea and their esophagus sliced through to be killed some other way, but this is what the experts said. Robert Dennis from the Bardaster identified the body as that of John Buchanan, the intermediate passenger, from his clothing and from the colour of his hair. The next witness called was Mrs. Abraham Tomlin, Anne was her name, and she was the young wife of a bullock driver. Now, bullock drivers were known to be the most rough and uncouth people in the entire colony, so very much a working class woman. She said that on about midday of the 17th, a gentleman, and she knew he was a gentleman because he wore a stock tie and had on a white hat with a black ribbon, arrived at her door to ask for a glass of water. And that was not unusual. It was quite usual for people to go to houses and just ask for a drink of water when they were thirsty. Afterwards, after the glass of water, he brings out a bottle of brandy. And he offers to share it with her and her friend who happened to be there. She took a little, just a little. And then, because she was a hospitable woman and he was a gentleman, she offered him lunch, dinner, which would have been bread and cheese, at her table. After they had finished their lunch, he continued to stay for another 3 hours. Mrs. Tomlin is not impressed, and eventually she asks him to leave, and saying as an excuse, perhaps, or perhaps it's the truth, that her husband is due home soon and that he has a temper and he's likely to kick up a fuss and perhaps, Mr. Buchanan might come to some harm. So it indicates that her husband may have been a violent man. Now, Buchanan, by this time very full of brandy, becomes belligerent and he asks if her husband has any pistols, and if he does, he wants to see them, and he will shoot him. He will shoot the husband. Of course, his lovely Anne says, no, my husband doesn't have any pistols. And then Mr. Buchanan says, well, does he have a razor? Show me his razor. Now Anne says, of course he has a razor, and I'm not going to show it to you. And then she and her friend leave. Now, it's a normal thing for a woman to, if a man's being very difficult, to take themselves out of the situation. She's had to leave this man in her own home, and she and her friend go out to Oakley's. So we've got Oakley's. So they go to Oakley's, which is a little tavern on Gillis Street. And it was probably very similar to this existing building, not nearly as swish as the Southern Cross. It's the sort of place where wrestling was held for prizes of ribbons. So when she and her friend get back, or when she gets back to her home, she finds that Mr. Buchanan has left, and he's left behind his bottle and his corkscrew, which she shows to the jury as evidence. Did her husband come home while she was gone? We don't know. There's no record of him attending the inquest. Now that could have been because he didn't have to. It was mostly voluntary for people to attend an inquest at that time. Or it could have been that he had an alibi, that she just said that he was coming home to get rid of her unwanted guest. The inquest was adjourned to the next day, Saturday, to allow the coroner to send warrants to bring in witnesses from the ships. Now that was quite unusual. As I said, mostly people attended voluntarily. It was quite unusual for warrants to be sent, but obviously Stevenson thought that in this case that was necessary. But unfortunately the inquest was actually not reconvened for another week. So it didn't come back until the 4th of February. Now that gave plenty of time for everybody to get their stories straight. Okay, so here we've got a map of sort of the locations of everything in relation to each other. So on reconvening, Mr Gorton was called, and he's consistently misnamed as Mr Gordon for the whole time. Now that would have been despite Robert Dennis knowing very well what his name was. None of the ship's lists had him misnamed, and of course Stevenson would have been well aware of the difference between Gorton and Gordon, so it's interesting that he's chosen to call him Gordon. So Mr Gorton admits that he brought ashore £2.10 and paid for dinner, and does not know what became of the rest of the money, because he was too drunk. I don't know. Oh, just disappeared. He admitted having words with Mr Buchanan, but he could not remember what was the cause. He did not remember charging Buchanan with having taken the money, but he had not the least suspicion that he took it. And I think that's the truth, because he wouldn't have understood, he wouldn't have known that money was missing till he woke up and Buchanan was gone. So he couldn't have argued with him about that. And he obviously thought he'd taken it. Perhaps he thought he'd just get it back when we got to Sydney and he wasn't too bothered. Perhaps it really got under his skin. And remember, it was $400, not an inconsiderable sum to have lost. So Gorton was asked if Mr Buchanan had ever expressed any intention to harm himself, and he said no, he was not of a cheerful temper, but he had never heard him say anything of that nature. And this is corroborated by other unnamed witnesses. Okay, so this is a close-up of a little bit closer of what we're looking at. So we've got the Southern Cross Hotel there on Curry Street, and you can see that Gillis Street is about half an hour's walk away. So remember that Buchanan left the Southern Cross early in the morning, and he doesn't turn up to the Tomlins' house until midday. So there's a lot of time where he's missing in that time frame. Perhaps he was asleep under a tree, who knows. From the edge of Adelaide, and of course he was at Anne Tomlin's until 3 p.m, and then from the edge of Adelaide to Dashwood Road is about an hour, perhaps a little bit longer if you take it easy. So the direction that he's going is about as far away from the Barraster as you can get, and it might have been that he had some idea in his head that he was going to make a run for it. I don't know. Okay. So this is the recap. I'm just going to leave that up there and let you read it, because what I want you to do now is to have a chat to the person next to you and think about who might have done it. So please do that. At the sound of the gavel, I'll come back here and then we'll ask you what your deliberations are, and we'll look at their verdicts. And meanwhile, I'll have a wander around and I'll be asking any questions. So please, talk to the person next to you, introduce yourselves, and tell each other what you think. Oh, don't be frightened, nobody bites. What do you think?
I'm just going to say this
We must be involved.
No. Yeah, no, that's my answer.
no one ever saw it.
I'm still on.
The wife, the husband, they came home. Yeah.
I want to know where Mr. Tomlin is. I want to know where Mr. Tomlin is and all this. He should be called up. He's the wife of... he's the one with the razor and no gun. Yeah, I reckon. Who do you think it was? The monitor? The book? Yes.
Not the book.
Yeah.
Well, Queen-Victoria might not.
Well,
Wasn't there. She might have had a razor under her. definitely. Yes, no, it's all of that.
No.
What?
Exactly.
Including himself.
Not, well, that'd
Couldn't
be,
do that yourself. He had plenty of drink.
well, that helps. Once the bottle was empty, when Anne came back, if the bottle was empty,
Yeah, but they're all right, so they were brought in.
they were what?
They were brought in for one stage. Actually, on the same coming up the street in town, I wondered if we'd ever done anything on the
Nearly got off the sink. Yeah. You reckon that's
Hope.
great
so you're related? You're doing
She goes back to Jacob.
Oh, is that what you mean? The bullet trailer.
And I have to comment on
cheap rent.
Well, he would have had something to carry
People here. 38 people here today.
We We all know who's done it. We've got it.
We got it.
We've solved it. Next.
No, too far. That's okay. Hi. Well, thank you all for your time. So what we want to do now, we need to have the next slide. There we go. We're all ready? Okay, so good people of the jury, I'm going to ask you by a show of hands, which of these outcomes you believe to be the true result of our inquest today. So, hands up if you think, oh, I haven't got my thing back on, sorry. Put that back on.
That's it.
That helps.
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
No, I wasn't paying attention either. Okay, so I'm sure you all heard me because I was speaking rather loudly. So, was it death by person or persons unknown? Hands up if you think that it was a murder, but you just don't know who did it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. About 14 of you. Okay. How many of you think that it was death by suicide? No. Not a soul. How many think it may have been Abraham Tomlin, the angry husband of the one hand is okay. Otherwise that's cheating. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16. Ooh. How many think it was Charles Frederick Gorton and his friend who he stole from? Not a soul. Okay. And how many believe that it was an open finding? So no evidence that it was murder or suicide, just don't know what happened. A couple. 2. Okay. So I think that the case seems to have been decided as the death was caused by Abraham Tomlin. I shall send the constables out to arrest the man forthwith. Now the original verdict was that Buchanan died of an incision to the throat, but there was no evidence before the jury as to whether it was inflicted by himself or not. So they came to an open finding. Buchanan may be buried at West Terrace, but there's no records before 1840, so we just don't know. The Bardaster sailed home to Sydney. Mr Gorton lived a blameless life, but he remained a heavy drinker. The Reverend Purvis preached at the Scots Church in Jamieson Street in Sydney. Robert and Charlotte Dennis moved down to Yankalilla, where they became pioneers of that area. And unfortunately, we don't know what happened to the Tomlins. They've just disappeared into the midst of time. So, if you're interested in any updates regarding my book At the Hem of the Empire, which this makes a very small appearance in, but is not the major part of that book, please pop your names down, as I asked earlier. After that, I think that's about it. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Robyn. That was most excellent. But first of all, I'd like to... Any questions from anyone? We've got a Chris. Yes?
Yes, the chap Stevenson that did the inquest.
Yes.
You said there was gaps in his note-taking and his
Yes.
record-keeping.
Yes.
Was he known to leave gaps in other inquests, or was he always very...
I actually haven't looked into that. I've just gone on this. This is published. I found it on Trove. And that's the only record there is of this inquest. There's no other paperwork held anywhere in South Australia that I can find. So, but I'm not aware. No, I'm not aware. I haven't looked into his other inquests. This was just something I found sort of as an interesting aside while I was looking for other things. So I haven't actually gone into it at that sort of depth. But it would be interesting to know how much of a reliable person he was. Yeah, yeah. But that's right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting point. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Ross.
What are your thoughts? Who do you think?
Yes.
Oh, well, it's interesting. I originally thought it may have been Gorton, and I've actually spoken to a descendant of him, and he lived a blameless life afterwards. And someone said to me, well, you know, why would he have shouted in dinner if I said, you know, you've spent 4 months at sea with someone, you get to really dislike them. But he said, well, they went to town drinking and he shouted dinner, so, you know, perhaps their relationship wasn't quite so bad. And it's interesting, but this is the third time I've given this talk, and the Tomlin has come up every time as a very strong contender. So he's, you know, people have said he may have thought that Buchanan was trying it on with his wife, which was highly possible. He was a gentleman, and gentlemen just, you know, viewed working class women as prostitutes. So, you know, maybe that's what happened. Or it could have just been a passerby who drunk under the tree, and someone just took their chance.
Took the wallet.
They took the wallet and took their chance. I don't know. It's a mystery.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether you mentioned how far between where the body was found and the Tomlin's house.
Well, Tomlin was on the edge of town, so it would be about the hour's walk. Yeah, the Tomlin's house would have been at close to Gillis Street, so probably in the parklands, because they had bullocks, and they would have just been letting the bullocks graze in the parklands area, because they wouldn't have had enough money to own land. So yeah, very close to Gillis Street, I would think, but I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah.
I'm thinking, reading into it a little bit more, the wife of the man, the woman that was drinking with the stranger, she would have been annoyed that he was still in her house, so maybe she mentioned to her husband when she saw him, and that's what's prompting him to kill him.
Man, it could be possible.
Because, you know, I mean, it's her house and she's had to leave.
Yes, she's had to leave, and yeah, she's had to leave because there's a man who's just not doing the correct thing. So yeah, there's a reason for them. There's certainly reasons. Yeah.
You suggest he hunted him down?
Yes.
Well, it's possible. It's possible, and the fact that he was found out where he was, and he was very drunk, and it was a hot wet day or hot weather at that point. You know, he may have got a lift with someone. And then, yeah, Tomlin could have hunted him down. It's quite possible.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much again, Robyn. I really appreciate it. That was a magnificent piece. We have a little the group.
Oh, wow!
We'd like to present you with a thank you.
Oh, that's amazing.
So once again, thank you very much, Robyn.
Oh, thank you.